Artillery is based upon the type of battery and the makeup or number of cannon which are in the battery. For each cannon which is part of the battery, the basing width or frontage is 1/4 inch. So for example, an 8-gun battery, like this French battery here, would be 2 inches in width. If you go over to this Danish battery of 10 cannon, it's 2.5 inches in width. Or if you go out to this Russian battery with 12 cannon, it's 3 inches in width. Panning to the right, we have some Swedish artillery with 7 cannon, and we have a British battery of only 6 cannon, being 1.5 inches in width. Now you can have other battery sizes, so if you have different sizes, obviously the basing would be so changed. You can even go down to, for instance, like a 4-gun battery, which would only be on an inch-wide basis. And when we're talking about this basing, we're referring to positional or field artillery. We're not referring to siege artillery, which I'll cover in the next segment. Last but least, for horse artillery or cavalry batteries, you normally will be basing or mount a horse figure or mounted figure with a horse of some form on the base. It makes it easier for the players to distinguish between a foot battery and a horse battery. Austrian and Bavarian Wirtz type batteries, where the gunners actually rode a seat on the trail, you might not, instead of having the horse, you have that long trail with the long seat and the gunners riding on it. That would again be very representative. Now I use the word positional or field battery. They're both one and the same. The guns would look the same. But for example, this Russian 12-pounder out here on the far left is a positional 12, which means it won't move as actively on the battlefield and has a doctrine of basically standing in place compared to a normal field battery like this 8-pounder. Field batteries have abilities to move about the battlefield much more efficiently compared to a positional battery. They usually are on a lighter trail or carriage, and the barrels typically are shorter or less in weight compared to a positional piece. Last but least, notice that there's a number of gunners change. Once you get to 9 guns or more, for instance this Danish and this Russian battery, you use 2 gunners per base. If you're 8 guns or less, you only use a single gunner per base. This is only considered to have one figure on it, i.e. the gunner figure here. The horse is a permanent attachment to the base, and it's just representative that this is a cavalry or horse artillery base. That being said, we've concluded the artillery segment. I'm going to go on to siege artillery, and then we'll move on to train. This short segment is going to cover the aspect of siege artillery. But before I go into siege artillery, I'm going to put an additional footnote to the previous artillery section, and that all artillery bases are based with 3-inch depth. This is uniform for all positional and field artillery, and it also includes siege artillery, which I'm going to cover. So you know what the frontage of an artillery battery is. It's 1/4 inch per cannon, but the depth is uniform of 3 inches. And this depth represents not only the immediate cannon in the forefront of the battery, but also the additional train and wagons and ammo reserve trains and carriages and things of that nature, which all make up part of a common artillery battery. That being said, let's move on to siege artillery. Siege artillery, if it's based on the battlefield, is going to be on a common base just like regular field artillery. But if it's in a siege situation, it's going to have earthworks dug in, additional sap work here in the back area. So in theory, typically it would be deeper than 3 inches in depth. In this particular case, this one happens to be 5 inches. The thing which is unique about siege artillery, when it's on the battlefield, it's still on the 1/4 inch per cannon rule. So this being an inch and a half wide would represent 6 24-pounders. And the definition of siege artillery in the game is anything that's 18-pounder or heavier. So you got your 18-pounders, your 24-pounders, your 32-pounders, your 36-pounders, all the way up to, in theory, I guess, a 48-pounder, which is known as a full cannon in the old terminology of artillery. Big, heavy guns, very hard to move on the battlefield. Definitely positional or sit-in-place type artillery. Now, as a good common thing, players should not mount their actual cannon on the base, as you can see here. And there you can change the number of cannon that are represented on the battlefield to maybe, like for instance, an 8 cannon base, a 10 cannon base, 4 cannon base, whatever. Because siege artillery, unlike regular artillery bases, generally has no battery organization. It could be anything, literally. And the same thing would apply for siege mortars and siege rockets and things of that nature. So the basing is much more flexible if you leave the cannon detached, and you can exchange out the bases underneath to represent the number of cannon. When it comes to siege works, the difference where here it's a 1/4 inch per cannon, in siege works it now represents a 1/2 inch per cannon. And this represents the greater dispersal of siege cannon, but obviously due to the sheer amount of firepower coming out of a typical fortress or other position like such. The cannon are dispersed, and therefore it's much harder to hit them compared to a regular field cannon where it's a little bit denser. That being said, let's move on to the train section next. Train models either represent unique characteristics or capabilities, or they're just generic for the battlefield, or it could just be eye candy. It's up to the individual player. But for most armies, they're going to require some form of an ammo train, and they may or may not require some form of pontoon or pontoonier type train. Your typical train model is going to be based on a 2-inch by 4-inch base, with some place on the train model a capability to remove a figure to represent if the train drivers ran away from the train. In this particular example, I've got them based on a cavalry type basing, which would be 1 1/8 wide by 2-inch depth. If it happens to be a foot figure, you can base it on like 3/4 by 1 inch or 1/2 inch by 1 inch. It's really up to you. There's really no hard fast rule here. Sort of similar to the artillery figure, which is typically on a 1/2 inch by 1 inch base. This little 3-figure pontoonier group out here, I based on 3-rank formation, which would be 1/2 inch by 1 inch. And typically for a pontoon train, you're going to have the actual pontoon train itself and a pontoonier battalion to go with it. Sort of a 1-for-1 type relationship. Nations of all different types and colors have different types of trains. This is a Prussian train, so it's going to Prussian blue type. The mid one is a French train. We have an Austrian train. And out here on the right, we actually have something called the Artillery Reserve Base. In the game, the Artillery Command has unique capabilities and is represented by an Artillery Reserve Base. And that's why this thing looks so much larger. It's actually a cluster of trains together, and also represents spare or reserve artillery batteries. It's a representative base for that type of thing. It's pretty massive. The players can just really build it as big as they want to, but I made mine for this example to be at least the size of 3 full trains in total size and footage. Other generic trains could be like this forge unit. This represents a forge, pretty generic. Got some basic wagons going down a road here with an Austrian wagoneer. Got a French ambulance with a French train driver, and as I mentioned earlier, this is a pontoon train. Pontoon trains typically are going to be on that longer basing of the 2x6, where all the other wagons typically are going to be on the 2x4 basing. There's many varieties of trains. It's really up to the player's consent, but for the game purposes, the ones that really are important are the individual ammo trains, because they represent the ability for the batteries to get additional ammunition and the infantry as a full supply for the battle. And that's covered in the actual game rules. With that being said, we've concluded the artillery and train basing segment. My next segment to cover is the headquarters or command level figure basing.